Hello everyone. It's 3 UTC exactly now. So we are going to start for this webinar, Introduction to TMS WEB Core. Welcome everyone. This is a record number of attendee subscribers for this webinar. So thank you very much for your interest and thank you for your time and attending here today for this introduction on TMS WEB Core. Maybe to make it clear for everyone, this is an introduction session, was announced as an introduction session. So that means that we are really going to start from the basics of how to get a web application from TMS WEB Core. If people have already some experience, maybe you can learn something here and there, but this today is really targeted at people who are new to TMS WEB Core. I see a message that someone is not hearing me, but I see at the same time that other people can hear me, so I suspect indeed that it must be a local issue with the sound. Verify the selection of what audio channel is going to your speakers. That's usually the case. So let's get started. Let's not waste time because there is a lot of content today in this webinar. And this wouldn't be a TMS webinar if there wasn't a surprise for you, but this surprise is reserved for those who can keep up with me for the next hour. And so at the end of the hour, I will give you this nice surprise. So let's dive into the materials and let's start from the beginning. What exactly is the architecture of a TMS WEB Core app? I think that is very important to point out, as we still receive from time to time requests from user support questions that indicate that the concept of a TMS WEB Core application is not always understood as it is. The architecture is actually very similar and actually the same as modern web frameworks such as Angular, Vue, or React implement. Basically, we create in single page web applications. That's the official terminology from web developers for this kind of application. Single page application means that this application starts from a single URL. And by starting it, it actually means, okay, you open an HTML page with a JavaScript application that runs in your browser, and your application will run during all of its lifetime on this single page URL. And that doesn't mean that there can only be one page in your application. No, there can be multiple pages, forms in your application, but they all are invoked from this same page URL. So basically, when you create a web application with TMS WEB Core, you will create an HTML file, a JavaScript file, the application JavaScript file, and most likely you will be using some CSS, some images, and maybe other resources. As this is all standard web application or file types, you can use any web server to deploy these files to. So any web server will do, whether it's IIS, Apache, or some more exotic web server. All these web servers will do. If they can serve an HTML page and JavaScript, they will be able to serve a TMS WEB Core application. For your database or any other services that you want to access from your WEB Core application, you will typically use a REST API. For those, and I guess many of you are familiar with the FireMonkey framework, it is very similar where when you create a mobile application running on a mobile device, your data will also typically be stored somewhere in a backend database, well, you will also typically use a REST API to get and put data on this data backend. And this happens via the REST API, so you will perform HTTP requests and exchange JSON. How do we create these web core applications from Delphi as we want it in our favorite language, Object Pascal? Well, this is achieved thanks to using the Past2JS compiler. So this is a compiler, or some will prefer to name it a transpiler, and this compiles or transpiles your Object Pascal code into JavaScript. So basically, while the DCC32 is creating a Windows executable, here our Past2JS compiler creates a JavaScript file. So it's a kind of a direct equivalent from an executable, but here it will be a JavaScript file that will be your application, and it is the browser that will run this application. Past2JS also includes the RTL, which is the equivalent or similar to the Delphi RTL, and meanwhile it covers already a lot of what is available in the Delphi RTL. When you create a VCL application for Windows, you will typically want to use the VCL framework. And it's no different when you create a web application running in the browser. You can consider the web core framework as something similar to the VCL, where we have controls, components that enable you to use an object-oriented, component-based approach to create these applications. And of course, all this is integrated into the IDE. And today we are going to discuss the Delphi IDE. Everything will be shown and presented from the Delphi IDE. While actually what I show today and what is available, you can do that in the same way from the Visual Studio Code IDE or from the Lazarus IDE. But today we stay in your familiar Delphi environment. So this is a little bit how the architecture is built up. Everything starts from compiling Object Pascal code to JavaScript with the Past2JS compiler, helped with the RTL, and of course the Web API. Web API here, I mean the API to manipulate everything that is happening in your browser. So you can consider actually Web API very similar to what you have in Windows. With the VCL, you also have Windows.pass, which wraps the Windows API. Here we need to do manipulations in the browser with the DOM, manipulate HTML elements. So for that, we make the Web API accessible via Pascal functions, classes, etc. On top of that, we have on one side the component framework, similar to the VCL, where we have buttons, list boxes, memos, and so on. And on the other side, you will want to access backend data, cloud services. So there are also components and libraries provided to access your backend. And this, from the user interface components, this consists of, on one side, standard controls, just the same way like you have it in the VCL. And we also offer you the choice to use jQuery controls. And still on top of that, we have FNC for the web. For those familiar with the FNC components, this is a component architecture, or rather some call it an abstraction layer, that allows us and you to develop components against this abstraction layer. And while doing that, you can take advantage of these controls for VCL applications, for FMX cross-platform applications, for LCL-based Lazarus applications, but also for web core-based web applications. And I see a question here. what FNC translates to. FNC stands for Framework Neutral Components. And so that means that this is a component architecture that is really neutral versus the framework you use it for. If you have an interest in FNC, there are quite a bit of videos covering what FNC is on our website. I also see a question if we plan similar functionality for C++. Well, everything depends, of course, on the availability of compiling or transpiling C++ code to JavaScript. At this moment, this, as far as we know, this does not exist yet. So if that would become available in the future, that's definitely something we would have an interest in and have a look at. If we go and have a look at the components, well, we have different kind of components, as I explained, standard, like VCL, button, timer, etc. There are the FNC components. So meanwhile, our entire portfolio of FNC components is web enabled. So whatever component in the FNC family you use today, know that you can use this component also in your future web applications. Other than that, we have web-enabled components, and this includes jQuery components, but this also includes wrapping several web libraries and functionality APIs. And those you will most likely be very familiar with are the Google Maps API. So that's provided, included Google Charts you can take advantage of, and so on. But I think you all are here to see code, to see an IDE, to see the world of developers. So let's first have a look at the basic, how can I say, the basic architecture of an TMS WEB Core web application. So here I am in Delphi 10.4.2. And we have installed TMS WEB Core. That means that in the project types that you can create, you have a new entry, TMS Web. And under this entry, you find various types of WEB Core applications. For this webinar today, we will focus on standard TMS WEB Core web applications. So this is the type of application that we will select today. It is creating a basic project template now for us here in the Delphi IDE. Here it is. And what I will do first is save this project somewhere on the machine so that we can inspect what exactly it generates for us. So I created on a new folder. Let's name this webinar 1. Okay. So our entire project is created now. So let's have a closer look. Let's have a look at how this application is actually built up. Here in the project manager, you can see that we now have project1.web, where typically you would have project1.exe. So this is the web application that will be generated from this project. Different from a VCL application, here you have project1.html. That is actually the HTML file from where your web application will be started. And then we have the first form, unit 1, holding the first form. And as you can see here, there is also something a little bit different than in a VCL application. Here you have an additional file, which is unit1.html. And unit1.html is the HTML file that you can use to fine-tune the appearance, the layout, and etc. for the first form in your application. If we open this project1.html and inspect the code, let's have a look at the code. If my IDE is a little bit willing. So what do we see? We see here, this is the most important line in this project1.html. You can see here a reference to the JavaScript source, and it stands for $projectname.js. So this is actually the JavaScript file, the application JavaScript file that is invoked from this HTML file to launch, that is launching your application. So this project will create project1.js, and in your resulting HTML file, it will refer to project1.js, and by here this little script that says rtl.run, this is a method that you find in project1.js, and that starts your whole application. Other than that, we do not have much important things, a page title, some metadata, an icon for your application. But other than that, for a basic application, there is not much more than that. So let's start and add some controls. So as you can see, there are a whole lot of controls here under TMS Web. So you have TMS Web system controls, you have data controls, data access, and standard controls. So all these things are available. And as you can see, it is modeled after the VCL to make VCL developers really familiar, to reduce the learning curve significantly for entering web development. So what I will do here is add some code, and we will get the text. And I guess that you have all been writing in your Delphi Programmers Live code similar to this. We will simply use the value from the edit control, and we will add it to the list box. So when I run this application, you can see that it compiles now. So it compiles the used Pascal code, and it will generate the web application. Now this is a little bit inconvenient, as I have a dual screen, and it outputs the browser on that other screen. But okay, we have it here. I guess you can see it now. And obviously, when I add things to the list box, they appear immediately. So let's have a look at what has been created now, what actually happened behind the scenes. And I had created my project in webinar 1. And so what we see is that it has created a folder TMS Web. And this is actually where it generated the files. We have created default our project in debug mode. So the files have been generated in the debug folder. And you can see here that you have 4 files that have been generated. So obviously there is the project1.html. You will see that when I open this HTML file, that it has replaced the script line, so the $project name, by project1.js, and this starts our whole application. Then the JavaScript file, this is the compiled result in JavaScript from our application. And then we have project1.js.map, and this is the purpose of this file is specifically for debugging your applications from the browser. So and that using Pascal code. By default, your browser only knows JavaScript code, and all debugging would happen via the JavaScript language. When you provide such a map file, you enable actually that you can debug and you see your Pascal code from the browser, step through your code, and do everything you're used to when debugging an application, an Object Pascal application from the Delphi IDE. And then we have unit1.html, and this is the form file. But as you can see, this form file is rather empty. So the body is empty. So we have not added anything special here to this form file. Let's inspect our web application. And very important, and I see it very often in support-related questions, that Delphi developers do not yet have the habit of opening the browser console. The browser console is where all the interesting information is about your web application. So the console, you can open it here via this screen, developer tools, or I always use the F12 key. With F12, you toggle to open and close the browser console. So if we look at the DOM for this application, we can see in the DOM that a button, an input control, and a select HTML element have been added to the DOM. So this clearly shows that when you add a T-Web button on the form, that this actually generates within the DOM of the browser a real HTML button element. So this is no kind of simulation and custom control whatsoever. No, this is the real HTML button element. And the same applies for the T-Web edit. That is a regular HTML input element, and the list box here is an HTML select element. So all this has been generated from your web application. If we look at the console, there's nothing to see yet. It's normal. There are no errors, no console or logging. So it's kind of normal that we see nothing, and that's a good thing. I quickly have a look at the questions here because I see several questions coming up. Is this platform designed for a large number of users, say 10,000 users or smaller, for internal company use? That's a good question. Actually, this kind of architecture leans very well to really a high number of users. Why is that? Because what is generated, your application that is generated, only consists of HTML, JavaScript files, and that's it. That's basically kind of the same thing as you have for static web pages. And that means that any server, but also any technology to do the load balancing on servers, can be used to make your web application available for thousands, hundred thousands, and even more users. You can deploy it on an Azure server, for example, and as you go, as your user base grows, you simply add additional resources on your Azure cloud, and that will work all out of the box. Other question that I see is, can the platform be used for reset services with JSON responses and also produce HTML responses? I believe that this REST, the right question is REST services. So we are talking here about creating a web client application. So it's a web application running in the browser client. And that web application can perform HTTP REST requests to services. And actually, it's agnostic to what kind of service is running in the background. So any kind of server can be used. It can be our TMS Xdata technology. It can be Embarcadero Red Server. And today I prepared actually a small example with DataSnap. We know some users, customers, use even PHP as a backend. So any backend actually will do. Another question here is, let me have a look. what will need to be installed on a web server in order to access data in a database on the server. Okay, this is the backend part, and this depends on your choice what backend you will use to make that access possible to your database. We offer TMS Xdata for that. So you create an Xdata server that already creates automatically for you um, a REST API to access your database from there. We also offer with Xdata the Xdata client data set that connects directly to your Xdata server. The Xdata client data set sits, of course, in the WEB Core client application and talks with, accesses the REST API from the Xdata server. But that also applies to using a DataSnap-based or an Embarcadero Red server-based backend, or Marmot can be used. There's also Mars REST server, open source framework. So there are many choices. I see a question, how about the size of the GS file built with Delphi? So Sergey points out that what we generate here is a 1.5 megabyte JavaScript file. That's correct. Here it is compiled in debug mode. In a moment, we will see the difference when we compile to release mode, where you will see a significant reduction in size of this JavaScript file. Note also, indeed, the size is relevant, but at the same time, know that this is a static JavaScript file. As long as your application is not changing, this JavaScript file is always the same. And that means that when your browser accesses the application the second time, chances are very high that it will use a cached version of the JavaScript file. So you have actually no extra download typically when you launch the application the second, the third, the fourth time, etc. As long as your application is not changing, of course, then the cache will be invalidated and there will be a new download. Other questions, is it possible to customize the appearance via CSS? We will see that in a moment. I will show you in a moment. Is it possible to refer to a C++ library? That would be needed to handle server-side. So if you create a REST server and you access from that REST server some C++ library, you can even build your REST server in C++. You can use any existing C++ library from there. Okay. I'm looking at the questions. I will not go in depth about the comparison of WebCore versus UniGUI versus Sencha XGS. I think these are three quite different architectures. First of all, WebCore generates web client applications running in the browser, entirely in the browser. And these are really standalone applications running in the browser, but they access via a REST API the backend. UniGUI is actually what they call a full stack web application framework. So that creates a server application. And so it's the server you need to deploy, and it is the browser that accesses this server and requests typically for every new page or every new form that you open in the browser, it will access your server again. For a WebCore application, this is not the case. When you start your application, it typically does not even need the backend if there is no real need to get new data. So that's a major difference. Sencha XGS is a kind of, it's rather a framework of controls for building your user interface, for building clients, but all your application, your user interface logic, application logic for XGS is typically written in a JavaScript language. So that's really a kind of different beast. All right, let's move forward. And here, I leave this open. You have seen the basics, and I would like to, we can go here. I would maybe like to first show you how you can debug in your application. So when I click the sources tab here, I see the source code for in Pascal. Thanks to the map file, I see the source code for my web application. So here I can set a breakpoint. And when I click the button, you can actually see that my breakpoint was hit, and I can inspect, I can step through the code like this. And as you can see, well, maybe it's not really visible. Let's add some other text like hello world, and I click, and the breakpoint is hit again. I step through the code, and here you can see that my variable s got the input from the input control hello world. And here, when you step through it, you see that as I step, it is really added to the list box. So this is how you can debug your applications directly from the browser. While we are at this topic, I would like to point out the difference between debug mode and release mode. So let's switch now to release mode and compile this application again. Notice here on the dialog that it says obfuscate. So that's an extra step that is being performed also for applications compiled in release mode. Application starts, behavior is of course 100% the same. But let's have a look at the output files. We have the release folder. And so now you can see there are only 3 files. There is the HTML file, obviously. There is the application, and note the size of this application. It's only 300 kilobytes versus for our debug mode application, 1.7 megabytes. And there is no map file. Obviously, you will not want, if you deploy your application, that someone can just step through your Pascal code. So without this map file, that's not possible. And then we have the form file, form HTML file here. So if we open the browser console now, we will not see any Pascal source, and you can see that also the JavaScript code is obfuscated, compacted to make it as small as possible. So that's a lot less convenient, of course, for debugging purposes. That's the release mode. There is one other thing that I wanted to show you, and well, we can show it in debug or in release mode. That does not really matter, but let's have a look at the project options. Under TMS Web, we can see all the options for our web application. And as you can see here, we have 2 options: enable obfuscation, enable optimization. When you are in release mode, these will be by default both true. Optimization here means move away any unused code. So if there is a class with some method and your application does not happen to use that method or the code for that method will simply not be included in your JavaScript file. And the obfuscation step is an additional step where it will use an existing established, I would say, project cursor that performs obfuscation of your JavaScript API. So that means a further reduction in size of the JavaScript code that was generated. These both are enabled when you compile in release mode. But there was an interesting property that I wanted to point out, and that is the single JS file option, which is default true, and I will set it to false. When I set it to false, I will compile and run the application again. And let's see what happens now. Obviously, application is still the same behavior. But when we have a look now at the debug folder, we can see a large number of files. And if you pay close attention to the files, you see a bunch of GS files and gs.map files. And if you take a closer look, you see that there is actually here, for every unit that is involved in your web application, there is such a JavaScript file. And your form, which is unit 1. So also for your form, there is just one GS file. Possible advantage of this approach is that when you opt for this, typically the framework GS files, as long as your framework remains the same, as long as you develop just your application and do not change the framework, these GS files will stay the same all the time. Only your form GS files will change, possibly if you change your Pascal code. And this can be a choice if you say, okay, I want to have all files cached except the files that change, and that will be typically the application form files. As you can see here, this is only 4 kilobytes. So all the other files will typically be cached and remain on the user system, and only the changed files, only the small files will be downloaded. So that's an additional choice that you have for a deployment choice you have for your web applications. All right. I see a question meanwhile. Are there elements to show and control a video? Yes, there are. Actually, there is a demo for this. If I have a look at the WEB Core repository under demo and services, there is a demo, I believe. Where is it again? It will be in the web folder. No, I just don't remember where this exact demo is. But there is a media component, and you simply set the URL to that media component, and it will play the video behind that media. All right. Let's have a look now at form layout, form control, the positioning of controls on the form. As you can see here, these controls are absolute positioned on the form. So what you see is what you get. At this position, you will get the button in the browser, the edit, and the input control. But that's not always desirable. That's not always wanted. Especially, this is also not responsive in the sense that there is no automatic adaptation of the position of your controls when your browser is, for example, a mobile device browser, much smaller, and versus a desktop browser. So what you can do is make this, for example, all relative positions. So this is controlled with the element position property. And here I set it to relative. And when we inspect the result of that change, you will see that the browser will control the layout of your controls. And obviously that's not expected, or what I thought that should change. Maybe that's my caching that is a little bit intervening here. I will, for my convenience, switch back to single JavaScript mode. Let's inspect. I put it all to relative, and let's compile and run again. Okay, and this is what I expected. Here you can see that the browser put these controls just one after each other, control the layout itself on this form. Okay, so we have the list box here, we have the button. Functionality is still the same, everything is the same, but it is actually here the browser that controls the layout. Why do we have first the list box, then the button, and then the edit control? Well, we can inspect that. We have actually a property child order, and I did not care about the child order property. So let's reorder it. Let's make the edit control the first one. I set it to 0. Let's make the button the second one, set it to 1. And let's make the list box the third one. I set it to 2. And we run it again. And the result is then the following: first the edit control, then the list box, and then the button. Functionality is, of course, still the same. We are going back to absolute position mode because now I want to show something about styling. There are a lot of properties, like for this list box, we have modeled the properties after the VCL. So you have a color, you have font, you have all border style properties. So all very similar, all very the same as you have in a VCL. But what if you want to use, for example, CSS styling capabilities? Well, I'm going to show you how you can use Bootstrap, which is one of the most popular web styling frameworks. How you can use Bootstrap to apply Bootstrap styles to your web core applications. For this, I check the context menu of my project in the project manager, and I select Manage JavaScript Libraries. And here you can see a number of typically useful JavaScript libraries that are often used, often desirable to have. I will, for simplicity, opt to have Bootstrap 3.37. Why is that? Because Bootstrap 4 also requires a jQuery. So then I need to check another jQuery framework, but actually I can achieve pretty much the same with just Bootstrap without jQuery. What actually happens when I click this option? We see the effect if we open the project HTML file and go and have a look at the code. This is actually what happened behind the scenes. When I clicked on Bootstrap, this link, this reference to the Bootstrap CDN was added to my application. So this will take care that the Bootstrap libraries are loaded along with my application. What happened in addition is that when I go in the object inspector under element class name, here I can select the CSS classes that are available in my application. And here it figured out that Bootstrap is enabled. So I can select all the Bootstrap styles that are classes that are available here via element class name. Every control has such a property, element class name, and that allows you to set a CSS class for this specific control. For this example, I will use a commonly used Bootstrap style button and button primary. I will, for my edit control, I will select form control. And I will actually do the same for my list box. I will also select form control like this. But when I will make yet another change, which is I will let the browser no longer use the absolute size that I specify, but I let it determine the size of the control itself. So height and width, you have a height style and a width style. And so with these properties, you can tell the browser, figure out yourself what the best width and the best height is for this button control. When I run this application, we will see the Bootstrap library being used to apply a style. And as you can see, this is the button primary style. Functionality is still the same. And as you can see, when I focus the control, we get this Bootstrap focus highlighting of the control. So this is all achieved by using Bootstrap. All right. And let's go yet another step further. We will now use HTML to define how our form will look. And so I opened the HTML file for this form 1. And now I will add some custom HTML to this form HTML. Let's add hello world. And let's add a div element. And in this first div element, we will add an edit control. So it will be an HTML, input element. And we give this input element an ID. I give it the ID EDT. And that's it. The auto-completion here of this HTML editor in the Delphi IDE leaves a lot to be desired, in my opinion. But there are many other nice tools for editing HTML, so it doesn't matter too much. So I make it an edit input control. I will add another div. And in this div, let's add a button control. Let's also give this button control an ID. And let's add some text to this button control. And finally, I will add a select control. Also give it an ID. ID list size, I set it to 4, for example. And now I do nothing. I just added this HTML and I will run this application. Let's see what happens. And as you can see, my controls are still here. They are still working. But in addition, I have these controls that I specified, or better, HTML elements that I specified in my form HTML. And you can see them being rendered by the browser. Now, the nice thing or the interesting thing is that we can actually hook our controls to this HTML that we edited. And this hooking can be done by assigning for the button the element ID property. We assign it to the btn HTML element. We do the same for the edit control. We assign it to the edit HTML element. And for the list box, we assign it to LST. And when I run my application, you can see that this is the result. So here we have our edit control. We have the button. Functionality is still the same. But as you can see, it is already also Bootstrap kicking in. And Bootstrap that is taking care of positioning, layouting the controls this way on the form. And so this actually enables you to use or design, layout your forms fully in HTML, or let some web wizard, some graphic specialist make a very nice web page. And actually you link your controls, your UI logic to these HTML elements where you need some specific functionality. Meanwhile, I'm going to have a look at new questions. Daniel is asking a question. Can you show or the display of another form via a button click? Actually, yes, I can do that, but there is a demo for that. And this demo can be found under basics here, under basics. And here you have the demo multiform. So in multiform, you can see actually here you can see two forms. Unit 1 and Unit 2, two different forms, and you will find the code. It's basically quite similar to invoking a second form from a VCL application. You can see it in this demo. On the same topic, there is also another interesting demo, which is the form hosting demo. And what we do here is we actually host another form within the main page of the web application. So this is the main page. And we will, in this demo, show how you can host in some specific area that you point out, how you can host a secondary form inside this area and then also switch it with yet another secondary form. So this is an interesting project if this is of interest to you to have a look at. Another question that I see is load and save the list box contents to local storage. Yes, that is of course possible. There is an unit. Let's bring up this code, and there is a unit that handles local storage. And this unit can be found here under core source, and it's called weblib.storage. And here you see two forms, two ways to store values in the local storage of the browser, which is first of all the local storage, and it's the session storage object. You can consider this quite similar to working with an ini file in a Windows application. That's actually how we conceived it. You have keys and values, and you can simply add to this local storage with specific keys, values, and they will be persisted across sessions. Other question I see is how to deal with the form container. Okay, that's a good question. This is our web form, and if we inspect the web form properties, we see here the form container. Form container is by default not specified. So what I can do, well, this is not a good example as I already switched here to make this template based. So maybe I have to modify my HTML again, remove all this. And let's unlink the controls by clearing the element ID. Okay. Good. Let's see if everything is back to absolute positioned, and so that we have some way to show the use of the form container. So we are back to a normal. Okay. And what I will do now is edit this HTML file, and I will add some div. I will give this div an ID. I give it the ID, my form. Okay, and I will also give it some style, and I will give it the style left, let's say 100 pixels, top, let's say also 100 pixels. I give it the width of 300 pixels, and height also 300 or 400 maybe pixels, and let's also give it an background color so it's really good visible, and I make it yellow. Okay, and let's first see if my HTML is all nice and good, and we see the div where we expect it to see. Not really. Oh, okay, of course, that's my mistake. Position absolute, that's something that I need to do, and then it will be where I expect it. Okay, now it is where I expect it. As you can see, the form is still rendered in my main browser window. So through the form container, I can now make my form render within this specific div. So I select here in form container, I select my form, and let's run this again. And have you seen that the controls have shifted, are actually rendered now respective to the div that was my form container. So my entire form will sit within this div. If we inspect it actually via the DOM, that is also what we will see. So we go to elements, and as you can see here, we have this hello world thing that was in my form HTML. We have the div, and within this div, you find the controls of the form. So that leaves you the possibility to design a header, a footer, other static content for your web application, and just separate this from the form itself where you run it. So that is actually why there is this form container. If you have a look at our demos, you will see that all of our demos are using the form container, because all of our demos are using the same header. And so we simply reuse that same header, and we redirect the form to the area below the header via this form container. Going over the questions, local storage is possible, particularly in Miletus applications. Yes, exactly. That goes a step further in Miletus applications, but I guess that's a topic for another session, because we still want to have a look at database access. Is there a list of websites that currently use WebCore? We have not a list, but actually there was a blog article on Monday that shows the star analyzer. I see already a reference further down in the chat box pointing to this sample application. There are others. There is another in Brazil. It's used for submitting tax forms, also a widely used application. In Belgium, there is one for attorneys coming. But we have not bundled it yet. Not everyone wants it to be shared as well. So, but that's indeed a good suggestion to at some point bring this all together so you can see these references. Now I want to take you a step further and have a look at databases, or better, how you can do something with a backend. And for this, I already prepared some backend code with a sample created with DataSnap. I created this with DataSnap just for the reason that you can simply take this code. You don't need any additionals, no third parties whatsoever. This can compile and run out of the box with your Delphi IDE. And so even in professional, as this is, if I'm correct, a Delphi professional that I'm using. So let's open this web module. And what you can see here is a DataSnap web module. I added FireDeck to access a SQLite database. And I added two methods. I added a method getChars for the getChars query string, and I added an updateChar for the updateChar query string. So that's a simple DataSnap server. So I will run this server on this machine. I will start the server, open the browser, and you can see, okay, this is on localhost. And Jens is making a good remark. He is expecting a lot of Mercedes cars. There will be a lot of Mercedes cars among them, of course, but also others. We have respect for all cars. And as you can see, this is the JSON returned from this simple DataSnap example server. So how can we now create a web application that uses this data server. So I create a new application, okay, and I add a web client connection, web data source, and web client dataset. 3 components that will enable me to do that. What I will also add is an grid, and I will add an DB grid, all very similar to a VCL application. So obviously I will connect the web client dataset to the client connection. I will connect the DB grid via the data source to the data set. My data source I connected to the data set, and we are almost up and running. Only thing that I need to do is specify the URL for my REST API endpoint, and I specify this in the client connection.uri. That's the property that I set. And actually, there is not much more that I do. I will show what you can do here. You can already learn in this data set what DB fields are in this service. So here at design time, we figured out, okay, these are the fields returned by the JSON endpoint. So all that I will do is set this connection to active and run this application. And let's see what happens. Here is my server. It shows a little bit logging what is happening. And as my page starts, you have seen that I have a get cars request. And you can see that my grid is filled with cars, of course, also including a lot of Mercedes cars, but also others. That is hooking up the DB grid via a client dataset and a client connection to a read endpoint. So I get the data to be filled in this DB grid from this endpoint. How are we going to extend this now to also provide an editing capability? Well, I prepared an example for this, and this example is here. It's actually the same as the project that I demonstrated, except that I added the functionality to update the car. If we inspect, let's maybe inspect first the code in the data module that handles the updating. Here you can see the update action in my web module. And you can see here that it passes JSON to this request. I will parse the JSON. I will get out of this JSON packet. I will get the ID of the car to be updated. I will, here in this small example, just update the brand and the type, and that's it. I will locate the car via its ID in the table, and then I will update it in this table. I will update the fields, the brand and the type, and perform some logging. That is what is happening. And if we have a look at the web application, here, when we edit something in the grid, we change the data. This will trigger the client dataset after post event. And it is in this after post event that I will fetch the modified values of the dataset. And I will create a JSON packet to be sent to my DataSnap web backend. So here you can see the URL that I specify with the update car request parameter. I perform an HTTP post here, and the post data is my JSON packet, including the brand, the type, and the ID to be updated. And then I perform this HTTP request. What you can see here is this await this await command. And this is actually an instruction to tell the code that it should only execute this console log after this web request.perform was executed. This is for a good reason, because in a web application, HTTP requests are always asynchronous. So that means that if you execute the web HTTP requests, it will normally immediately return and only asynchronously report that something was successful or failed. By using await, I can introduce the same logical sequence in my code, even though when there is asynchronous code or code happening. So let's execute this example and see what happens when I'm editing. Okay, and so let's also keep the backend here handy. And now let's say that I will make Audi and I will change it to audio. And as you can see, as I posted it in the DB grid, you have seen this update car request coming in, and it has been updated in the database, a SQLite database here in this case. If I restart my application, it will perform the request to get the cars again here, this one. And as you can see, if we go and have a look, this actually returned the modified data. So this proves that the data in my database was updated via this request. A final word that I wanted to mention with respect to using backends and creating your own backends is something when you're new to this that most likely you will run into immediately, and that is CORS. CORS is something web specific, and I actually prepared a URL where this is explained. So this stands for cross-origin resource sharing. What does it come down to in a nutshell? In a nutshell, the browser will actually prevent that by default your web application can perform requests to services from other domains, which is in many cases desirable, that you cannot just create another web application on another domain using behind the back services from a domain. Take, for example, I would make some kind of clone of Amazon, and let's call it www.amazonclone.com. And from this website, amazonclone.com, I would perform all kinds of HTTP requests to the original Amazon servers, and show products, let people buy products and whatsoever. This, of course, is not something Amazon will want, clearly. And that's why browsers invented something like cross-origin resource sharing just to prevent that. And actually, with this mechanism, you simply prevent that the browser can make a request to a server sitting on another domain. As long as your web application is hosted on, served from the same domain as where your backend is, your server is, you will be able to make these requests. So even here in this case, we have a CORS problem, or a possible CORS problem, because our web application is on domain localhost port 8000, and our server is at localhost port 8080. And so that's already a potential reason for CORS to knock on the door and prevent us. What CORS will do is prevent us from making this access, so your endpoint will simply not be accessible. Here in my data snap example, I made it actually via this before dispatch event handler, when I set in this header access control allow origin and star, so that means star accept requests from any domain, it will still allow our request. And that's why actually it works that I can request from localhost 8000 something from my backend sitting at localhost port 8080. So that's something to pay attention to. Typically in debugging phase, you will simply allow everything. And then when you are ready to deploy, lock down the things so that no other web applications can take advantage of or let's say abuse some backend service from your application. So with this, I'm through the majority of the content that I wanted to show you today. As an introduction step into WEB Core, this is, I would say, scratching the surface, as there is, I think I can talk for 3 days nonstop about WEB Core. So maybe I will first, the slides you will receive in the email, so that covers, there is one more thing that I wanted to show you, which is FNC. FNC is web enabled, so I think it's worth showing that as a final example. So let's create a new web application. Okay, like this. And now I will add an FNC chart component on this form, like this. This is already quite complex control, and equally complex is an FNC planner. So both on the form, let's run this now in the browser. The code base is, of course, now a little bit larger. The FNC code base has grown and grown over the past couple of years. So now you can see in the browser these both complex FNC controls running out of box, and of course its user interface also fully functional. So everything you could do from a Windows or an FMX application, you can do it from the web application, including things like here moving, editing, etc. And that was also something that I really wanted to show you here today. Debugging we covered. Okay, and so before we go to last questions, let me have a look. Can the URL an IP address for the database? Yes, if that's an IP address, that's also a valid address to host your backend on. That's possible, yes. FNC Planner, can it be optimized for mobile? There are a couple of settings actually in the FNC component specifically created for mobile usage. And let's have a look. If I go under options, where is it? FNC Planner. Let me have a look. I believe it was under, if it's not under options. No, let me have a look, because where are these options? Here it is, interaction. That's what I was looking for. And here you can see a couple of settings that are actually specifically designed to make it easier for mobile usage. So here you can see the move mode, for example, automatic if it's desktop or mobile. So you can you have a lot of settings here that allow you to fine-tune the usage for the platform where it is running. Another question is, do we get the sheets of your presentations? Yes, of course. We will send out an email, most likely tomorrow, with the replay of this session for those who missed it or want to replay it, and including the PowerPoint for this presentation of today, and also including the DataSnap backend sample code. So you can also play with that part of it in WebCore. Is it possible to include another website in a small part of the screen? Yes, that is possible. Actually, that's quite simple. There is a component web browser control, and actually I believe that I should be able to show here. I never tried this, but let's see. I should write it with double S. Let's see what's happening. It's still including FNC, the FNC units. Okay, it's not working. Interesting. It might be that our website blocks this kind of use. So let's maybe have a look at the browser console if it's saying anything interesting. No, it's not. If we have a look at the HTML elements, we see here an HTML element. Okay. If the URL is not correct, it's kind of normal that it will not work. So let's see with this correction if it has any positive effect. And there it is. This is our website in a small area in this web application. And Jens, is there a need to call navigate? If you want to change, if you want to add some code to dynamically change this page, of course, you can do that. And it should be something like web browser control dot navigate, and let's navigate to Embarcadero like this, and let's see what happens. Okay, so this is our website, and now I clicked to navigate to Embarcadero, and I see stuff coming. Indeed, this is the Embarcadero website. Will that embedded page control work on mobile also? I see actually no reason that it is not working. If any one of you is following this, of course not, it's not live. I see that Rainer is confirming that it works. I see no reason why it should not work. So it's expected that it works actually. All right. Okay, I see no new questions. Now is the opportunity, if you have more questions, to speak up and ask the questions. Of course, I know that you're all waiting for the surprise, and here is the gift we have for you. And actually, we have a special. We really want to make you enthusiastic about WebCore, make you want to start using it. And that's why we have, for you who stayed with me here the whole hour and some more, a 25% discount. So the coupon code is shown here. It's applicable this week, so you have time till Friday. TMS-web webinar-0521, and the links where you can validate these coupon codes. These links, you can find them here on this page for the 3 license types that are available: the single developer license, small team license for 2 developers, and site license for any number of developers in the company. I see more questions. Is the session recorded? So far, it looks like everything is recorded. So we will make the replay available for you. We expect to send out an email with the link to the replay for all who registered. So you can watch it at your own preferred time and pace. Thanks, Richard, for your kind words about WebCore, FNC, and Xdata. As I said, I only scratched the surface today with the kind of introduction, beginners steps for WebCore. FNC can be added to that. We can tell a lot about it, but also Xdata. My colleague Wagner is overviewing, managing the Xdata backend server product. He has also already given sessions on the Web Academy. You can see the replays of these. So also interesting to have a look at the replays. Actually, the environment that you are using at this very moment, which is the tmswebacademy.com, this environment was entirely developed using TMS WEB Core. So the code behind is all Object Pascal, and we created it all via TMS WEB Core. Thanks for the many kind messages. Michael, I see Harold, Thomas. It's going very fast. Is there an ETA for Xcode? Wagner said this year, but I'm confident that it will be much earlier than December, which is kind of the deadline for this year. Maybe there will already be a beta in the coming months. Robert, many thanks. Also Terry, thanks a lot. Dimitris Kounaklis is asking, do we expect Miletus for mobile devices? That's a good question. The answer is no. The answer is this is for desktop, and Miletus will cover Windows, Linux, and macOS. You will actually be able to create Windows applications from a Mac and from a Linux. You will be able to create Mac applications from a Windows and a Linux machine. You will be able to create Windows and Mac applications from a Linux machine. So all these kind of capabilities will be possible. We do not expect to target mobile. And the very reason for that is that the progressive web application type is already fulfilling a lot of functionality, especially for installing and running offline through progressive web applications. And an additional advantage that we would lose with Miletus is that when we would wrap a mobile application in a Miletus shell, so to speak, this would still require that you publish your application on the Apple Store and the Google Play Store. And the progressive web application allows you to install applications on the mobile device, both iOS and Android, without these stores. So you can simply bypass these stores. And with respect to content and your business model behind these applications you can choose, and you do not have to take the rules of Apple or Google in account, and more specifically, pay what is due to Apple, for example. That's the advantage of a progressive web application. That's why we believe it's the best choice for mobile devices. That does not that does not mean that you would have to create two different applications with the web core. And actually, my colleague Roman knows everything about that. With a single code base, you can create a progressive web application and at the same time target it as a Miletus desktop application. So with pretty much the same code, you can create these different types of applications. Roman, my colleague, actually targets everything: a web application, an Electron application, a Miletus application, a progressive web application, all that from the same code base and the same project. With some care, that's perfectly possible. I'm looking at the questions. I have a client server application with an Oracle DB. What steps to follow? First step, I would say, is to have a look and make your choice between the technologies that are available for creating your backend. And when you made that choice, I suggest to first have a look at creating a REST API for working with your Oracle database. And once this is ready, you can create your web client application that uses this REST API to talk directly to your Oracle database and build your application like that. Stan is asking, will TMS WEB Core run on Lazarus? Actually, it is already running on Lazarus. So if you prefer to use the Lazarus IDE, you can install it for the Lazarus IDE. Actually, on the website blaisepascal.eu, you will find a download for Lazarus IDE with detailed steps and downloads for the trial version of TMS WEB Core for Lazarus. And it's actually working on Lazarus on Mac, on Lazarus on Linux, and of course also on Lazarus on Windows. And actually, everything that I showed today is also working exactly the same way from Visual Studio Code. So our web core for Visual Studio Code, everything that I've shown, you can do exactly the same from Visual Studio Code, but with the exception, of course, that you can run Visual Studio Code also on Mac directly or on Linux directly. Having a further look at the questions. Okay, thank you very much. So much kind words. It's heartwarming to read all these nice words, and of course, it's an incredible motivation to continue and deliver all the hard work. Thanks, Bruce. I know we've been talking via different channels. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Mark, also. Thanks, Joseph. Know that if you get started with WebCore, we have our support center. And so there's already a lot of, I think, useful answered questions there where you can search and find answers. But if you have new questions, of course, you add the new questions there, and our team is going to try to help you as fast as possible. The next thing, actually, one of the next things coming up in 1.8 will be, now we have Miletus included, which is a technology to create a single executable desktop application from your web application. Now it's in version 1.7 included for the Windows target. In 1.8, one of the main new features will be that we will deliver the macOS and the Linux targets. Thanks, Franz, Alessandro. Thank you very much as well. Malte also, thanks a lot. Let us know also, now this was an introduction to Web Core. There are many topics to cover. And let us actually know what next topics you would like to see more in depth, and we will create this content for you. This was a kind of first introduction, first overview. We can talk about, for example, a completely different topic would be creating your own custom controls via or for TMS WEB Core. Actually talking about custom controls, there is already some useful things available. I will show you the page. If you go to, I believe it's about, and then web, and here you can actually see custom controls, additional controls, wrapping several libraries or created from the ground up that you can add to WEB Core. So here's one to manipulate, to read and write XLSX files directly from a web application. There is one to generate the vCalendar files. So these are these ICS files that are typically attached to an email or are downloaded when you make an appointment. Manipulate, actually open, create zip files. That's also a component that is available. We have a QR code generator and also a QR code reader that's also included. Here we have a collection of components, which is the smart HTML elements. This is all Pascal class wrappers for the smart HTML elements. That's a popular UI web control set from the company JQ Widgets. And this here is components for working with WebRTC servers, which is, we have two covered, the Jitsi WebRTC server and the OpenTOC WebRTC server. So if you want to use these RTC technologies for real-time video communication in your web applications, that's the place where you can be and where you can start. The Vaadin UI components is also a widget set fine-tuned at mobile application development, and here we offer free Pascal wrapper classes to start using these controls from a web core application. Screen capture component and wrapper for the Idera Fruala editor, which is an HTML editor that you can use directly from your web applications. If actually you have created a useful control or some interface to an existing JavaScript library that you feel that it will be nice to share it with other Delphi developers, get in touch with us and we will publish it here, and we will make some nice blog about it and inform your fellow Delphi developers that it is available. A question from Chris, actually a repeat question. Will it ever work for C++ Builder? At this moment, this is Delphi only, for the obvious reason that at the very heart of WebCore is the Pascal to JS compiler. So it translates Object Pascal code to JavaScript code running your application in the browser. So as long as there is no common availability of a C++ to JavaScript converter, it's kind of hard to support, or it's kind of difficult that it makes sense to create WebCore for C++ specific for that language. Of course, if you have Red Studio, you can install WebCore into Red Studio. Actually, we haven't tested, but I would actually believe that you can install WebCore in C++ Builder But what might fail is the code completion if that is not enabled for the Pascal language. If there is no Pascal in it, that could be problematic. Is it easy to wrap existing GS libraries? That's a good question. You can do JavaScript integration on different levels. You can take, let's say, I call it the easy way out, and you can do it more elaborate. And probably, I always suggest start with the easy way out. And once you are familiar with it, go deeper and do it in a more elaborate way. So how can you do it in an easy way? Well, that's something you can do with the ASM blocks. I will stop this server. I can quickly show you this concept. So here, what I will do is add yet another button. Okay, and from this button click, I will add here an ASM block. As similar to a VCL application where an ASM block allows you to enter machine code, the machine code of a browser is JavaScript. So in an ASM block in a web core application, you can directly type JavaScript code. And I will actually show you also the interfacing of Pascal variables with JavaScript code. So here I will add a Pascal string variable, and in my ASM block, I will call the typical JavaScript alert function that shows a dialog in the browser. What you see here, though, that's something to pay attention for, is that the Delphi LSP, the code inside, cannot make sense of JavaScript. Obviously, it was not written to deal with JavaScript, so that's why it's giving this remark here. I believe that you should be able to catch that with a conditional define to make the LSP happy. Yes, now the LSP is happy, and it will still compile, because when you compile, the path2js define exists. So let's run this application. Okay, it's showing on the other screen. Let's bring it back here, and let's click the button. So now you can see the JavaScript alert function that is using the Pascal string variable as this sets the message. So this is what I call the easy way out. Any JavaScript you have, you can directly include in these ASM blocks. If you want to go deeper, you can actually wrap Pascal classes onto JavaScript objects. And the technique used here is with the external directive, where you declare a Pascal class and you use the external decorator to specify what this Pascal class on what JavaScript object it maps. And when it maps on the JavaScript object, you use your Pascal syntax, but you are actually behind the scenes directly dealing with or working with the Pascal, with the JavaScript object. That is actually also what is already happening and what is already done for you. There is something like a TGS HTML element, which is a Pascal class for an HTML element. And with this element, you can, for example, do something like style set property, background, or yellow. So This is the TGS element. It's such a Pascal class that maps with the external decorator on the DOM HTML element. And doing this, it exposes everything like the attributes, the style, properties, functions, etc. And you can use it directly from your Pascal code. So that's a step further in this level of integration with the web world. Thanks, Jens. Thanks a lot. Thanks also for being here and for your time. Hoping to see you soon somewhere if this Corona allows us. Okay, an interesting question from Dimitris. Can we have a WASM keyword that will compile the contents of WASM? Yeah, to mix actually WASM with JavaScript code. Yeah, that is a very interesting idea. That is something very interesting, very useful, and something that is on our list of things to that we are researching and developing. Is there an easy way to convert VCL designs to HTML? Yes, actually, something that can help is the Midas converter tool. The Midas converter tool has as input a VCL application, and you can generate from there a web core application. So it translates actually your forms from VCL to web core forms. So that's something that can be handy. Take it with a little I would say additional note that, of course, when you use local databases, you will have to translate that concept to using a database served or made available via a backend. Another interesting question that I see here is about the Delphi versions supported. Someone is asking if this is where is the question? Yeah, if it's available for professional, enterprise, or architect. Actually, it's available for every Delphi SKU. So it will actually also work in the community edition, the 10.3 community edition. It will work with the academic version, professional version. So there are no higher level requirements with respect from the Delphi IDE. All right. I think and I hope that I have seen and covered all your questions. There are a lot of comments here to go through. If I somehow skipped or didn't see your question, I would ask to repeat it as there is so much. Or if there is still something in your head that you want to ask, now is the opportunity, I would say. If not, send us an email, your suggestions for next sessions. What we have in mind is an upcoming session specifically on the Miletus target, creating desktop applications with web front-end technology so that you can take advantage of everything that's available in HTML5, CSS3, and also interesting things like using what is the browser exposing already these days, the camera, microphone, USB, Bluetooth, all these things these days are available directly from the browser, and you can take advantage of them in web core application, and as such also in Miletus applications, desktop applications you create for 3 operating systems. All right, I see no more questions now. So stay in touch. If you are enthusiastic and feel like diving into the web world, take advantage of our discount that we offered. Maybe I will briefly bring this in view again. So this is our promo action for this webinar. This is the code that you can use. And these are the URLs where you can apply this coupon code and dive into this exciting world. All right, we are seriously over time, but the advantage of having created our own platform for giving webinars is that we have no constraints and we can go on till everyone is happy. So, no more questions. Thanks a lot for being here. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for all being great Delphi developers and giving so much energy and making the Delphi community really vibrant. That's actually what makes me happy, to see a vibrant Delphi community. For those of you who have a holiday tomorrow, enjoy the holiday and see you for our next webinar. Bye-bye.